Okay, good evening from tropical Philippines. Thank you, Dr. Lo, for the introduction. We will now be sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. Okay, thank you. So the title of my paper is quite long. It's Hiraya Manawari, the Relocation of Coastal Inhabitants and Vetiver Seawalls, implemented and planned programs for a happier and safer and more resilient citizenry in Tabaco City, Albay, Philippines. So, um, during the last century, the Philippines ranked as the country that was worst hit by natural disasters. Slight improvement, current century, we rank third. Now, a third of all natural disasters in the world are caused by typhoons. And unfortunately for the Philippines, an average of 20 enter our area of responsibility every year. Now, not all are direct hits, although 70% of our rainfall come from these typhoons. Now, where I come from, the province of Albay in southeastern Luzon, we are hit by at least 3 to 5 cyclones every year. These are more or less direct hits, making it the province that suffers the most in terms of infrastructure and agricultural damage. Tabaco City, Albay, unfortunately, is really right smack in what we call Typhoon Alley in the Philippines. Now, this is a map. These are maps of the Philippines and Albay, and clearly you would see that not only is Tabaco City in Albay province, it is also the one that faces the Pacific. So it's in northern Albay. So it's the first, basically the province's first line of defense during typhoons. Now, Tabaco City is in northern Albay, directly faces the Pacific. And I've been there on and off from 2004 until the present. And since 2006, we've had so many powerful typhoons. But despite that, despite being battered by typhoons, the city and its residents have found and continue to find ways to recover and actually really thrive despite such extreme natural events. And this includes and this is basically the meat of my presentation, the following achievements. Now, the city government, with the help of its citizenry, have implemented a program that relocates and rehouses people who live in danger zones, those who live along the coast and along waterways. Number two, an effort has been made to uplift the mental well-being of people after disaster situations or events. It started with seawall paintings, but it has now led to the creation of the city's largest public park, the Hiraya Manawari, which is made up of stuff destroyed by previous typhoons. And then, aside from the fact that we do have problems with typhoons, we do have seawalls that are made of concrete and steel. But since they're quite prohibitive, there have been attempts to make a green seawall or a green infrastructure along the shores of one of its island communities. Now, these achievements should be framed as products of the synergy of government and civil society, as well as an adherence to what planners and architects would call open design and community participation. Now, a little bit of information about government and civil society synergy and open design and participation. Well, in the first concept, you have a government that provides public goods and services, clearly, to help improve the welfare of the people and also to bring out the best in their potentials, the most out of their potential. Now, aside from coming up with programs and services for the well-being of its populace, government is also supposed to create programs that create what we call or develop or promote an enabling environment. Now, where does civil society come in? These people who are either organized or unorganized. Um, these people and these groups ensure that government and private sectors don't collude, which is something that occurs quite commonly in the Philippines. And then, aside from that, civil society, its members are sources of innovation and creativity and a source of volunteerism. And the recent national elections is proof of that. It pushes government and private sector to do better and change things. And there's also what we call buy-in. And a lot of development projects, be it by the government, by international agencies, have failed simply because it has not been accepted and bought in by people who are supposed to be helped by such things, such programs. Now, with respect to open design and participation, there's such a thing as overplanning. And the main idea behind open design is that Aside from providing blueprints, physical blueprints, you should also give guidelines that allow people space to maneuver so that they could become co-owners of such plans and projects. So, for example, you can come up with an open space such as a park, but how it develops, you should give people the chance to give their inputs so that they will appreciate and use such facilities in the end. Now, let's begin with housing or resettling of urban poor people in dangerous places. Now, the Tabaco City government has been doing this since 2006, but there's a clear example of what we call civil society and government synergy. Now, prior to the integration of disaster risk reduction as a common concept in the Philippines, the city government of Tabaco has been purchasing land or doing land banking for public services, for some public service purposes since 2006. Now, most in the Philippines, they say that there are two types of people who get to own land or use land: those who have the gold and those who have the guts. Now, people from informal settler families have the guts, and they're really gutsy because they live in what we call marginal areas, like those that are near rivers and near the coast, which are actually exposed to extreme natural events like typhoons and storms and massive rainfall. Now, in the early 2000s, a group of 20 urban poor associations in the city of Tabaco pushed the city government for land tenure and better housing, as they were inspired by another city in the Bicol region, Naga City, that had a civil society driven housing policy. So in the end, by 2002, the Tabaco City government listened and reacted properly by coming up with the first urban poor housing office in the province under the office of the mayor. And their main job was actually to give permanency to residents along the city center who did not have tenure with their lands. It was not yet concerned with danger zones. But after the massive typhoon of Reming in 2006, the local government began purchasing properties in the city's suburban and upland areas for the express purpose of actually resettling people in what we call danger zones. Now, at present, since they've been doing this annually, and this is in compliance with the law that 20% of city budgets should go to development work, 11 parcels have already been purchased in one upland and five suburban barangays and villages. Now, this is something that we have to realize with respect to Philippine resettlement and housing. Um, Local governments are supposed to buy lots so that when national government agencies such as the National Housing Authority and the Department of Social Welfare and Development have the funds to build houses, there's already a site that is ready and safe for these people who are the would-be recipients. So there's a synergy of local and national government and civil society, wherein the local government buys the land, the National Housing Authority or the national agencies will provide building materials, technical know-how, and also depoliticize the payment process of mortgages by ensuring that the local government will no longer have to get monthly mortgages from people. It is now these offices that will handle such things. So it depoliticizes the whole process. Now, recipients as a counterpart in the past provided sweat equity, but it didn't really work. So in the end, people are now supposed to provide what we call construction materials bonds, as well as contracts that they would follow the rules and regulations of the Urban Poor Office. Now, one lesson in disaster risk reduction that we should emphasize here is that institutional development is very important. You learn from your mistakes and you learn from doing your job. And the Urban Poor Office, Housing Office, is no longer just manned by two consultants. It has now a dedicated staff, a regulation officer, a civil engineer, an architect, social worker. Now, so far, by far, it is the most advanced in the province of Albay when it comes to what we call DRR-attuned housing systems. Now, it has its own code. The URPAO, or the Urban Poor Affairs Office, now has its own code of policy, and that has to be followed by beneficiaries. Aside from that, evictees from private and public lands, priority is now given to people living in what we call places at risk of storm surges and floods. Now, what is also important here, and this also related to development, is that in the Philippines, most people from the lower classes are usually not married. They're common law. They are common law husbands and wives. And as a result, what happens when they separate? Who gets to own the property? Now, the city government has made it a policy that only women are the ones who are supposed to sign the contracts in case this is they are in a common law partnership, so that the woman and the children are protected. Now, the identification and validations of informal settler families is ongoing in the city of Tabaco. And they found out that a tenth of the residents are actually ISFs. So this means that, we still have a lot of work to be done. It's not enough that we have these sites. We need to buy even more land and come up with ways to, get funds for housing purposes and not be dependent on national government agencies. But the lesson here is that during Typhoon Rolly last 2 years ago, November 2020, after that disastrous typhoon, the NHA went around asking for which cities or towns have land for housing. And Tabaco was one of the first to get funds because they already had land parcels. So the lesson here is it pays really to be ready. Aside from that, based on the different housing projects that they have come up, they are now improving the design of the houses and standardizing it to make it safer and more resistant from the ill effects of wind and water typhoons. Now, this is a river map of Albay, of Tabaco City, and it clearly shows that the place is bisected by so many waterways, and it all drains into what we call Tabaco Bay. And most people live along the coast, along the Poblacion or the city center. Now, here's another map that shows this where these people are being taken from and relocated to safer ground. And mind you, similar to Luchi Pototano's presentation, most of them are relocated. All of them are actually relocated within the city because understandably, people have lives within the city and we want them to be accessible to the city center as much as possible. Now, as you can see with the pictures from the different activities, it is really a woman-driven endeavor. And even when it comes to activities such as seminars, homeowner seminars, it is the women who are actually there. And on the right is a council resolution that authorizes the mayor to negotiate the purchase of property earmarked for socialized housing. So everything here is clearly above board. Now, here's an example of a not so nice housing facility. But these are the first resettlement sites, and they're not so nice. Clearly, they were still learning from the whole process. They were just desperate to get people out of dangerous areas. And eventually, it has become like this. So the lesson here is that if you are patient enough and you're humble enough to listen to other people, you can actually become better institution. And it thanks to the 20 groups that protested in the year 2002, we now have such a system in Tabaco City. Now, aside from providing housing, one thing that is really forgotten in the disaster literature in the Philippines is mental health. People don't talk about it, but it's actually a pressing problem, but it falls by the wayside in favor of what we call bread and butter concerns. Now, the city government of Tabaco has found ways to use taken for granted spaces and discarded materials and turn these sites and artifacts into sites of wellness and positivity in the midst of trying times. The lesson is not to discount the little things. And the Hiraya Manawari Park, which I said is now the biggest public park in the city, is basically located near a materials recovery facility. But it is now the product and what we call a product of open communication, negotiation, and buy-in between civil society and government. And this was done during the pandemic. Now, before they came up with Hiraya Manawari, they also had baby steps. This is an example of a seawall that was actually quite drab. And the tourism office of the city decided, you know what, we have a lot of artists in the city. Why not, after this typhoon, make them paint something? And the only rule that they had was it has to be decent and no nudes. That's about it. And this quote from an incoming city councilwoman who is from San Miguel Island. And because the seawall welcomes people or residents from Tabaco City, the island of San Miguel in Tabaco City, she said that these beautifully painted works made us feel that we were not forgotten and isolated after the typhoon hit our city in 2020. And actually, this is some sort of achievement, no? But it was basically a forerunner of Hiraya Manawari. Now, instead of celebrating in the traditional manner the city's Tabaco City cityhood, they decided, what if we use materials that was destroyed by previous typhoons, repurpose them, upcycle them, and show that symbolically we can come up with something that shows that we can always rise, build better, and be stronger in the midst of a crisis. So what they did was 16 officers of the local government, together with some volunteers, were given seed money and given all materials, the ones that I enumerated in this slide. And let's decide, let's just come up with something that we can do together as a group. Okay, and right now it has become a very popular hangout place for people. It is now composed of 16 sites, playgrounds, bars, camping sites, and barbecue areas. And these are some of the photos of the site after just 2 months of work. So discarded cars from fairs, playgrounds. There's a view of the Mayon. There's even a pond spa where you could put your feet, rest it, and the fish will, clean up your feet. That's what they say. I haven't really tried it. Even toilets are not sacred. They've been used as seats now, and it's quite popular among the people. So this is an example that if you do the work and you organize properly and you involve people, then you could come up with something that actually boosts the local economy. It has now become not just a recreation site, but a tourism site. Now, possible success story, green infrastructure or seawalls using vetiver grass and soil. Now, vetiver grass is a type of plant that actually is used for anti-erosion because the roots can reach up to 3 meters, and it has the tensility of hard steel. Now, in the beginning, it was actually a project of a local university and the city government to come up with a vetiver farm in the city grounds so that leachate from the dump sites could be absorbed by these grasses. Later, after they found out that it's really quite expensive to maintain seawalls, what if we could use it to make seawalls? So two consultants from a volunteer agency arrived in Tabaco. They had a meeting. I was actually part of that meeting. And they said that we could probably come up with a seawall made up of vetiver grass and local trees. Now, what we told them, we haven't experienced our typhoons, so we would suggest that we select a site where we can come up with an easy victory. Basically, come up with a 80-meter wall that is one-tenth the cost of a conventional concrete structure and see how it goes. So typhoon season arrives in September. The meeting was in November. So by February, they started constructing the said dike or the said wall. Now, this is what it looks like right now. And I farm and I actually have vetiver grasses. I assure you that within 3 months, this will become some kind of green belt. Now, the effect of this project is that people now have a green wall within another 3 months. Aside from that, people have decided that they could use the grasses for handicrafts and also the trees for firewood in the future. But more importantly, the mangroves that are just outside of this wall to be maintained properly because they saw that, okay, we also need to maintain this. So these are things that are like positive externalities that communities have started to help or come up with ways to even make the project even better. Now, my observations, the last slide. Communities in typhoon-hit areas can improve their resiliency through proactive governance, creativity, and cooperation among government, civil society, and even the private sector. Now, real development, the one that people from the below feel, provides space and freedom for people and groups to contribute and buy into an endeavor. Now, building and living better requires people and institutions to actually try out new things. Calculated risks are important. Now, developing institutions over time is actually a disaster risk reduction policy. We should always build on small victories, since achievements with respect to disaster resiliency are usually products of accretion. Now, And the last bullet is important because in the Philippines, they're coming up with the Department of Disaster Risk Reduction. Pardon my French, I find it really stupid from an urban planner's perspective, because I am one. I find it stupid because why do you need the disaster resilience office, another line or an extra layer of bureaucracy, when disaster resilience is something that should be ingrained in all aspects of life? So what works with respect to DRR actually helps attain other general welfare goals. With that, I end my presentation. Maraming pong salamat. Thank you.